Republic, Book 2. Book 2 begins with Glaucon asking Socrates whether he has really persuaded them that it is without exception better to be just than unjust. While Glaucon lends his voice to Thrasymachus, that does not necessarily mean that he agrees with him. A defining characteristic of the philosopher is that he or she can entertain an idea and contemplate it without affirming that that idea is true. So Glaucon and Adeimantus are going to restate Thrasymachus' original point that injustice is preferable to justice. Historically, they are Plato's biological brothers. So, Glaucon first says what the origin of justice is. This is sort of his version of a social contract theory, the reason why we agreed to form communities in the first place. The idea is that we would like nothing better than to stick our hand into other people's cookie jars whenever we felt like it. The problem is that we worry that somebody bigger than us is going to come stick their hand in our cookie jar. So we're going to make a loose kind of compromise. I won't touch yours on the condition that you promise not to touch mine. The interesting thing here, though, is the only reason I am agreeing not to touch yours is because I lack the power to do so and get away with it. The idea is that if I were truly immune from any sort of consequences whatsoever, so that I never had to worry about going to jail or about somebody else sticking their hand in my cookie jar, would I still agree not to touch yours? And Glaucon's point is, no, we wouldn't. In fact, he goes on to tell a story called the Ring of Gyges. And it's the idea that nobody is just because it's good to be just. People are only just because they're too weak to be bad successfully. This Gyges story is about a ring that a shepherd finds one day in the field. There's sort of an earthquake and there's a dead body and he pulls it off. He soon realizes that if he twists the ring, he becomes invisible. And what does he do? Well, of course, what anybody would do apparently, according to Glaucon, he uses the ring for self-serving purposes. He seduces the queen, and by seduce is a euphemism. He actually sneaks into her room at night, and use your imagination. And then he goes on to kill the king. So what is the point here? The point is, if you give a bad man that ring, they will use it for self-serving purposes. But if you give a quote-unquote good man that ring, they will also use it for self-serving purposes. The idea is that there are no actual good men. Everyone is intrinsically self-serving. The difference is that some of us are born powerful and some of us aren't. Those who aren't born powerful create this thing, justice, as a kind of excuse to mask the fact that we can't do what we otherwise would do had we had the Ring of Gyges. So, the idea is that nobody is good because it's good to be good. We're only good because we're afraid what will happen to us if we're bad, or we want the rewards of being good. So, that leads us to his sort of argument here. The idea is that the verb to seem is more important than the verb to be. This is Glaucon's key insight. What we're not going to do is talk about the sort of middlemen who are sort of just and sort of unjust, but we're going to compare the extremes, the perfectly just person versus the perfect villain. So the complete just person versus the complete villain. Now, what does it mean to be a complete villain? Well, if I'm a master liar, do you know that I'm lying to you? And the answer is no. The master of deception is one who can deceive the very people he's harming into thinking that he's helping them. It's about learning how to control how other people view you. If by the way that you speak, or dress, or talk, you can implant in other people's minds the perception you want them to have of you, you can then control their behavior in relation to you. So let me say that again. The perfectly unjust individual is a master of the verb to seem. He can control how other people view him. and he can also control how other people view anyone else too, so that he can paint himself as perfectly just while being perfectly unjust, so that he appears good but is bad. Now, what kind of life does this person live, this master of deception? Well, if you think about this in concrete terms, whether you get a job promotion, whether you get a good grade in this very class that you're taking right now, whether you win an Olympic medal, whether you graduate from college, whether you attain any sort of accomplishment or reward in the world, the idea is that those rewards depend less upon who you are and what you've done than they depend upon who others think you are and what they think you've done. If you can control other people's perceptions of you, you can go far in this world, Glaucon says. In fact, you can go the farthest. Now compare that life versus the guy who is perfectly just, but yet can sometimes appear bad. We need to see whether or not this person is still willing to be just, because if he's only just on the condition that he's recognized for being just, then he's not actually just at all. He was only just for the rewards or consequences, like Glaucon said. So we need to imagine the person who is good, but yet is stripped of that very reputation of goodness, and how he fares in life. Well, Glaucon says it quite simply that if you are good but appear bad, you will not get any rewards and you will get all of the punishments. For whatever reason, historically, morally good people tend to appear criminal to the society in which they live. The first person that comes to mind is Socrates himself, which was executed by poison by his own people, by the people that he was trying to help. Also, there's folks like Jesus and some other historical figures that are good people and yet who are actually convicted and sentenced to death as criminals. Something about being good often means that you project yourself negatively to the world, whereas sometimes being bad means you project yourself positively towards the world. So anyways, compare the lives. The perfect supervillain gets everything he ever wants. The perfectly good person gets crucified. That's Glaucon's argument, that it's more important to seem good. At this point, Glaucon's brother, Adeimantus, steps in to support what Glaucon had said, that it is a lack of power or manly spirit that makes people want to be just and dispraise injustice. They dispraise injustice simply because they do not have the power to be unjust. He says that this is true because one witnesses all the time that as soon as someone comes into a position of power, that person immediately works injustice to the extent of his or her abilities. Adeimantus also has some interesting comments about the god's role in relation to men. Often humans argue that one ought to be good and just because of the negative consequences of unjust actions, either in this life or the next. So, how does the supervillain escape punishment in this life? Well, first off, if he's a supervillain, he's going to go undetected anyways. But even if by accident somebody uncovers, he says that either by intelligence or force, this individual will be able to outmaneuver any opponent that he has. The ability to control how people think means that you can control how the populace views your opponent, so that even if you run into snags along the way, you can manage them. But that doesn't mean, however, that you can manipulate the gods. Or does it? Many people would argue that this world is ruled by fake people, people who create sort of personas to advance their own self-interest. But that in the next world, when people die, the gods see through fake people and will send them to hell, or the equivalent, Hades, if you will, or Tartarus in ancient Greece. But Adeimantus suggests that this supervillain has come up with a kind of way to avoid divine punishments. And it comes in the form of a sort of last-minute repentance, if you will. The idea is that the gods can forgive an individual up till the very end. So there's no point during your life that you've become so blemished or sinful that the gods cannot remove that stain. Because if there were that point, then God would not be omnipotent. After all, there would be something that God could not do, namely, forgive you. And that's exactly what most religious folks do not want to say. So if that's true, there is no point in time that you become so stained that you are beyond saving. That suggests that up till your point of death, if you go through the proper ceremonies, and each religion has different versions of this, in this time, if you give the proper sacrifices, namely if you, butcher certain animals, or if you donate a certain amount of your money to the church, the gods were said to forgive you. In a contemporary context, something like a deathbed confession is similar to what we're talking about here. The idea is, though, that you can live your life unjustly, but as long as you have time to go through the proper ceremonies at the end, you will be forgiven, so that you get to enjoy the fruits of sin now and go to the positive version of the afterlife, which was for the Greeks called Elysium, or what some people today might call heaven. That you would get to enjoy the fruits of sin now, but due to this sort of deathbed confession loop, you would then also get to enter in through the pearly gates. Now, why would anybody believe that the gods could be manipulated in this way? Well, the thing is that Adeimantus is not claiming to be a religious expert. He is deferring to the religious experts of the time, which are what were the equivalents of sort of the priests, or the writers of religious doctrine, or the interpreters of religious doctrine. If Adeimantus is not saying he's the expert, but he's also saying that it's a little bit sketchy to try to sit in a pew and hand pick or cherry pick which of the religious experts' testimony you are and are not going to accept. These religious experts are the ones who's telling you there is a God, and that he or she wants something from you, and that you need to do this and that in order to be in God's graces. It's not exactly fair to embrace their testimony when they say there's an afterlife, but just ignore aspects of their testimony about what can be done to get to that afterlife. If you are in a position to cherry pick in that manner, you would then be the religious expert, and you should be the one sitting up there rather than the actual religious expert is. So Adeimantus' point is, either we accept their testimony that there is an afterlife and that gods want stuff from us, and if that's true, then we accept their testimony that there is this sort of loophole, this deathbed confession loophole. Or we reject all of their testimony, which means that there's no fear of divine punishment in the first place. So there's no reason to worry about what's going to happen to you. So where am I going with this? It's the idea that this supervillain seems to be able to avoid paying for injustice even after he's dead, assuming there is even an afterlife. So he gets to have his pleasure now and his pleasure later. Now, compare that to the just individual who lives a life of self-denial, of not taking other people's cookies, of not doing things even though he probably could and get away with it. The life of justice is a life of self-sacrifice, of not getting what you want all the time. So that life of justice is one where you suffer now and hope that the gods will reward you later. So compare the two lives. The supervillain, pleasure now, pleasure later. The just individual, self-denial and pain now, for pleasure later. Adeimantus simply says there's no reason to deny yourself pleasure when there's no reason to deny yourself pleasure. So, if the just life is to be validated, the validation cannot be external. Rather, the just life must be good in and of itself. For if justice was valuable only for the rewards or to avoid punishments, then one would simply need to seem just but be unjust. In sum, all rewards and punishments are distributed based on people's perceptions of you. For this reason, Socrates must protect justice for itself.